All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 2, How Much Revolutionary Change. So in this section, we're going to look at some of the ways in which, colonial society really didn't change all that much as a result of the revolution. Of course, the American Revolution brought a new nation or a new country, the United States of America, right? First country based off Enlightenment principles. But some of the ways that kind of everyday people lived really didn't change all that much. So, for example, the status of women going from colonial society, and again, we could think of this revolutionary change as going from the colonies, so going from English colonies to the US. Not really a lot changed in terms of the status of women. So, for example, women's legal status and their economic status didn't really change. The idea or the principle of coverture. Coverture is the principle in which married women were legally and economically represented by their husbands. So, for example, when a woman got married, legally speaking, all of her property became her husband's property. This didn't really change as a result of the revolution. Same too with political participation. After the American Revolution, as with the colonial era, women were barred from holding office and voting. Right? So after the revolution in the United States, women were denied the right to vote and denied the right to hold office. But that didn't mean that there weren't women out there speaking about these issues. Ideas about the Enlightenment, natural rights, equality naturally gave rise to new voices that challenged these stereotypes. So, for example, we have a couple of examples here of how women sought to really kind of break down some of these stereotypes. Abigail Adams, who you see pictured right here, she was the wife of the second president, John Adams. John Adams was, going to be one of those founding fathers, which in the last section we talked about would be creating a new government. And what Abigail Adams told her husband when he was going to make, this new United States government was to remember the ladies, right? So we might say a letter to her husband about creating a new government. When all of those men are out there, John Adams was one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. He would be playing a crucial role in drafting the new government in the state of Massachusetts and would also take part in the debates about what a new national government would be. And all the people who were doing that were men. So Abigail wrote to her husband and said, hey, by the way, while all you men are making this process work, remember the women, right? Remember the women as well. Mary Otis Warren, she wrote about politics. We'll just say politics. We might also say economics too. She was an anti-British writer, but this was typically a domain that was dominated by men. There weren't too many women who were publishing these types of articles or pamphlets or publications about politics and economics. So she sort of challenged that stereotype. And lastly, maybe the most significantly was Judith Sargent Murray, who advocated for equal education for women, at least on par with men. This was at a time where men were generally educated, women were not educated, and Murray said that women should have equal access to education as well. And if you look at the American Revolution and the impact that it had on women, you could say that of all the fields that perhaps in education was where the most progress was made. Part of this was due to the principle or the idea of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood would be the role that women play in the new American society. Recall that it wouldn't be a direct role in terms of voting for a political office, but it still would be a civic responsibility. Republican motherhood can be defined pretty much as the responsibility for women to teach their children we'll just say American values. American values. So in other words, to contribute to this new country, who is going to raise the next generation of patriots? Well, that would be, women's responsibility. It was still very much stereotypical in a sense that women were expected to be mothers. Women were expected to sort of stay in the domestic sphere. But it was something that, was a responsibility not just for the family and the household, but for the greater nation. And in part because of that, you could see, some inroads in education. So, for example, there tends to be more women teachers after the American Revolution than it was before. It's not as stigmatized as an only male-only sort of field. But overall, right, we would say that, because of the American Revolution, there's no sort of, radical change. Things more or less stay the same in that regard. Another thing that doesn't really change all that much is the meaning of race. While certainly the rhetoric of the revolution contradicted slavery, and we'll talk about slavery here in a moment, it really wasn't applied in a way to improve or change racial perceptions at the time. You can find this in the writings of some of the founding types, those who played a role in the revolutionary process. You also find it in many of the early laws. So, for example, you'll see, or you can see this phrase, free white persons, pop up in various laws in the early United States. And that was to say that, whiteness was equated with citizenship, especially very early on, as it contrasts to Native Americans. Native Americans were not considered part of the U.S. Native Americans were separate. They were also sovereign in the eyes, at least, of the federal government. Native Americans were not American in the same way that French people were not American, right? They were French. They lived in their own separate sovereign nation. And many of the founding documents and founding types make clear that distinction. That's also to say that, for the most part, those of African descent or blacks in the United States, especially in the South, was essentially equated with slavery or enslavement. Now, there were some free blacks that lived in the North, not really in terms of large numbers, but you still had to deal with various racial laws, racial prejudice. So even in a place like the North, where slavery is on its way out, following the American, well, by on its way out, I mean over the next 100 years, it's on its way out in the North. It's still very much this idea or this connection between whiteness and citizenship. You can find it in a lot of areas. Now, perhaps the thing that most contradicted the principles of the American Revolution was the institution of slavery. This wasn't just Thomas Jefferson's contradiction, but Thomas Jefferson, in a lot of ways, is like the best. Actually, no. Let's call him the. We'll call him the personification. Fancy word. Personification of the U.S. contradiction. Right, and that is to say, within the Declaration of Independence and a lot of the reasoning behind why the United States separated from Great Britain, the idea of natural rights. Among those natural rights, things like life, liberty, right? These are all crucial. These are founding principles of the United States. And then you have the very real reality of slavery being practiced. And it's, you can't have both at the same time. It's either the United States is the land of liberty, or it's the land of, bondage and enslavement. And Thomas Jefferson himself best sort of represents this sort of contradiction, because in his writing, at least, Thomas Jefferson was someone who, if you had only read what he had written, sounds like he was against the idea of slavery. In many of his writings, he had promoted the abolition of slavery, but also the removal of formerly enslaved Africans from the United States back to Africa, recolonization. This was a popular position held by a lot of anti-slavery whites in the United States at the same time. But at the same time, even though while being against slavery in theory, he even went so far as to include it as one of the grievances that Great Britain forced upon the United States, but had to remove it pretty much to appease many of the southern colonies. In practice, Jefferson owned many slaves. We should also be reminded Jefferson was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. We also see this in his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved girl. Enslaved girl who mothered Jefferson's children. Right? And in the case of Phyllis Wheatley, who was not directly connected to Thomas Jefferson, but certainly challenged racial stereotypes at the time. This is Phyllis Wheatley right here. She was a poet. We'll call her an African poet. And, her poetry was so impressive that when people read it, they couldn't believe that a black girl had written it. They even brought Phyllis Wheatley to trial to prove that she was the author. And this, of course, helped sort of break down some of those stereotypes. But this contradiction, again, Thomas Jefferson, between slavery, natural rights, life, liberty, this is going to play a central role in the development of the United States, especially its history. And already early on, there begins to be not just a crack between those that, for example, may oppose slavery in theory or in their writing, but practice it as a reality, but also between the northern colonies and the northern states and the southern colonies and the southern states. And of course, their differing views on slavery will eventually get us into a place of civil war. On the other hand, there were others who took the ideals and principles of the revolution and maybe followed them to their logical conclusion. The American Revolution is sometimes referred to as the first emancipation. As an event, more enslaved people in North America were free than any other event besides the Civil War in the 1860s. Many of them escaped during the Revolutionary War. Some went to the British and fought for the British. Some sort of just escaped in the chaos. Some of them became free because northern states, right, again, going from colonies to now states, some of those states made slavery illegal. And then some of them got their freedom through manumission, which you saw in the aftermath of the American Revolution. A manumission is when a slave owner frees their slaves on their own accord. So this isn't a law that makes slavery illegal, but this is a law that allows for a slave owner to grant their slaves freedom if they choose. The historical example of this is George Washington, who freed his slaves upon his death. Thomas Jefferson did not free his slaves upon his death, only freed a select few, and I believe they were all that were related to Sally Hemings. I think you could probably count the number of slaves Jefferson freed on his own accord. You could probably count them on either one or two hands. Very, very, very little. But already there were organizations and groups that were at least voicing their opinions about the emancipation of slavery, namely the Quakers. Now, we already learned about the Quakers. They're a religious group. The Quakers had always been uncomfortable with slavery because of their religious beliefs. They believed in this idea of an inner light and that every single person has an inner light in them. And that sort of equates to sort of a spiritual equality, right? So the Quakers were always uncomfortable with this. It was only after the Revolution that they made it a kind of official church doctrine, so to speak, and that was to say that anybody who owned slaves could not be a part of the Quaker Church, or at least, officially. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society, we might say this is one of the earliest, just say one of the first abolitionists organizations. Some states, like I mentioned before, after the American Revolution, some states made slavery illegal, at least Massachusetts did. So the Massachusetts Constitution immediately abolished slavery. Now, there's a sort of distinction to be made between what legally happened and what actually happened on the ground. But at least in theory, Massachusetts is really one of the first places in the whole Atlantic world to abolish slavery. Now, it's maybe easier for Massachusetts to do that simply because there aren't as many slaves there. But, this is also in sort of the spirit of, of the rhetoric of 1776. Most northern states, however, opted for gradual emancipation. That is, most northern states. That was, they didn't end slavery like that, and suddenly all the slaves in the North became free, but they wrote laws that would gradually abolish slavery over time. So, for example, a law could be something like, well, everybody who's enslaved in the North, has to stay a slave, but their children will be free. Or, anybody who is over the age of 25 is free, and, or once they become 25. Now, of course, in a lot of cases, these sort of laws led to many slave owners, issuing manumissions because it was on the horizon. But eventually, this is what most northern states opt for. Whereas in the South, it's very, very different, right? And so you can see a big contrast between the way that governments like Massachusetts versus maybe South Carolina or Georgia, tackle or deal with the issue of slavery. And it was done, at least at this time, very much on a local level. There really wasn't too much talk about abolition on a national level, practically none. And this division between North and South, where the North gradually gets rid of slavery, and the South not only embraces it and keeps it legal, but it expands it. A lot of the southern colonies, now southern states, actually increase the importation of Africans into now the United States. And of course, there's going to be a long, windy road that we'll go through in these next few chapters. But again, like I mentioned before, we're eventually going to end up at a point at the Civil War. Now, for Native Americans, like we mentioned in a previous chapter, we could say that Native Americans were generally worse off as a result of the American Revolution. The United States, again, considered Native Americans to be separate. They were not Americans. They were their own separate sovereign groups or tribes. The Treaty of Paris made British land into American land. And that proclamation line, some of this is review, but we'll go over it anyways. The proclamation line that the British had set down before the American Revolution to try and stop violence between settlers and natives. Again, the British pretty much drew a line right here. This had all been British territory before, saying that settlers couldn't cross it. Well, now that it belongs to the United States, well, here come the settlers. And even for those Native American tribes that allied themselves with the United States during the course of the war, settlers and local governments really didn't take that in consideration. Most settlers and most local governments looked towards Native Americans, looked down upon them as an obstacle that's in the way, and really wanted to remove them in order to settle land. And so even for those tribes that allied themselves, many tribes allied with the British, many tribes stayed neutral. Now they're dealing with a country in the United States that is more eager, you might say, to take that territory. People like Joseph Brant, who had fought for the British, Native American man. So Joseph Brant is a Indian man, led armed resistance against the U.S. He had fought for the British in the American Revolution, continues to fight against United States encroachment But ultimately, the United States wins, and the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. We could say this opens Ohio territory to the U.S. To the U.S. So we might just call this a U.S. victory over the Indians. And like we mentioned before, a lot of those tribes in places like Michigan, the Northwest, Ohio, the powerful Iroquois Confederation, which had been such a centerpiece in that middle ground, that fighting between the French and the British and various tribes in this area. They end up relocating to places like Canada, for example. We really don't talk too much about the Iroquois in American history after the Revolutionary period because now all that territory not only belongs to the United States, but there's really no holding back many of those settlers that go there. So we could say again, status of Native Americans really doesn't change all that significantly, but they were generally worse off because now the British are no longer a factor in that area. One thing that did change though was the status of religion and how it relates to the government. If you go back to the colonial era, and we'll just kind of scroll up here, in the colonies, pretty much all the colonies had some sort of official religion. You couldn't hold office unless you belonged to a specific denomination. In Virginia, it was the Church of England. The state constitutions that they wrote pretty much got rid of any sort of religious requirement. So, for example, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, pretty self-explanatory, right? We might just say, gets rid of religious requirements for office, right? Religious freedom. And, given the history of the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, kind of everything that we talked about in the early colonial era and how much of a motivating factor religion was in warfare, this was pretty significant. There had been other sort of edicts and other sort of, declarations, proclamations of religious freedom around the world, but it was still a very much religiously divided place. The New England colonies were maybe a little bit slower to adopt religious freedom, but certainly by at least at the very latest by the 1820s, nearly every single state has gotten rid of that connection between church and state, or gotten rid of any sort of particular religious requirements in order to hold office. There you go, religious requirements.